So I was just going to start us off, I think, really by asking the speakers what role they think can communities like Comrie play in achieving a fairer and healthier economy. How do we encourage things like local development of skills, youth employment coming out of COVID-19? We have some fantastic local businesses in this area, like Comrie Croft, and related to that, the Tom Naha food production business. All things that are great in terms of encouraging local volunteering and local produce. But how do we scale that up, and how do we encourage that on a bigger scale, and what impact can we as a community have in this transition? So I don't know, maybe you can ask Katherine first on that.
Sure, lovely question, which I'd love to actually spend a couple of hours talking with you, and particularly hearing from folks in Comrie about their experiences and where they see the possibility to kick off some ripple effects from the work that's already being done in Comrie. I've just written a paper that was published earlier this year about a community that's very dear to my heart, a place called Linwood, just outside Glasgow. And I don't know if folks are familiar with the story of Linwood, but it's your sort of classic story of post-industrial decline, a town that had the economic carpet pulled out from under its feet, and all the challenges and problems that came with that. And then about 10-15 years ago, it was looking like there was going to be a very, very corporate-led economic model imposed on it. And the story is told a little bit in this paper that I published. And what happened is a group of amazing women, local women, just said, that's not for us. We are not having that economic model, that top-down, that extractive economic model imposed on us. And what these women did is said, we'll create an economic vision ourselves. And they had a huge number of consultations with local people, and they just started creating the sort of economy that they wanted locally. Now, it's been so difficult for them. There've been a lot of tears and heartache and setback over the years, and they're still a very vulnerable organisation, but they're quite extraordinary because these local women have really led the beginnings of a different economic system locally that starts up from the bottom up. And I think that significance of that goes beyond Linwood, because it's about saying, local communities taking control of the economic agenda and saying and it was a Tesco-led model, which would have been extracting of wealth upwards to Tesco shareholders, for example. And so what they're doing is saying, we want to kick off these local multipliers. We want to have local ownership. We want to create the sort of facilities that our community needs. And so the significance of what local communities are doing, I think, is way more than their impact and delivery in their respective localities. There's something very, very powerful about the message that that sort of community activities is sending. And partly to answer your question, the role is as a pioneer in microcosm, perhaps, of a different economic system. Now, since I wrote that paper, we've had Scottish Government say, we want to publish a version of that as a case study of what can be done differently. And it's a tiny example, but it shows you the attention that when communities roll up their sleeves and say, yes, it's difficult. I don't want to put any of a light that this is just easy, because I know it takes so much time and anguish, and it's messy, and it's really, really hard graft. But I want to just sort of say that the significance is beyond the locality itself, because it starts demonstrating the feasibility and the desirability of a different way of doing things. So to me, that's key. In terms of how do we encourage that sort of work, I think a vital role for our public sector is to underwrite community solutions, because it's going to be local people who know what the challenges are, but also have all the cool ideas about what different looks like and what needs to be done. And I think there is a role for our collective institutions is just underwriting those, so we can experiment, so we can do things that we've never tried before, but we think are really necessary. And I think there's a model for that, a small model in something like the Climate Challenge Fund that's sort of supporting local community initiatives in creating the sort of projects they want. And I'd love to see those sorts of initiatives rolled out, but I'll shut up there because I think Shonaig will have some good answers and good thoughts as well.
Great. Shonaig, can we come to you briefly, and then I'll move on to a few other questions. Great, thank you.
I think, as Katherine said, Comrie as a community is a pioneer in all of this with your development trust. And what I would ask you to think about is who you could partner with in some of the most deprived inner city areas. At Robertson, we've just given some funding to an organisation in Johnston, not very far away from Linwood, to buy the local police station because they need a community hub. They want to start to do things from themselves. So you actually promoting and sharing the lessons that you have learned on your journey would be good. I think the other thing is getting involved with your local authority in participatory budgeting and persuading more of your councillors that you should have a say in how your council tax is spent, all of that sort of thing. You would be a good thing for you to do as well, because you know you are an exemplar development trust and you should promote what you've done.
That's great, thank you very much. There was also a plea, actually, Katherine, if you could maybe send us a link, post a link to that Linwood article. That would be
I'll grab it now and put it in the chat. So go to Shonaig first for the next question. I'll dig out the link and put it in the chat.
So could we go to Chris Sanderson for your question, please? And maybe if Shonaig can answer that first while Katherine's looking out the article. If you unmute yourself, Chris.
Hi, Kathy. We had about 5. Which question did you mean?
It was one about incentivizing businesses to make the right changes.
Yeah, it was just what can we do? What are the incentives there? What were the incentives to sign up to the business pledge? We hadn't heard about it, so we weren't familiar with it, and we just wanted to know a little bit more about that. How could they be encouraged to do that? What was it in it for them to do that?
If you want to be in the procurement channels for Scottish Government, you have to sign up to the business pledge. So this is what governments and large corporates can do. It's how you manage your supply chain. So how companies can make a big difference is checking that all of the people in their supply chain pay the living wage, that they have an environmental sustainability statement, that they're not using 0 hours contracts, that they're investing in their workforce. And as far as I'm aware, if you want to get onto the sort of procurement frameworks for both Scottish and local government, you have to sign up to the business pledge. So if you want to win business, that's a way of doing it. And similarly, other businesses could do that. I think what we as individuals can do is not just in how we consume, but if we do, the vast majority of us, if we're honest, if we have a pension, we will be investing in large corporates. And we should be asking our pension managers, what questions are they asking to big corporates about sustainability, about 0 hours contracts? Because they're running our money. It's our money that's going into the FTSE 100 in particular, and we should be asking our pension fund managers, we should be holding them to account, asking them what they are doing on our behalf. So those are a couple of things that we can do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Katherine, did you want to come in on that one at all?
Yeah, just a reflection on the business pledge, because I think it, to me, illustrates the sort of my general take on Scotland, in that compared to a lot of other countries where I work and where the members of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance are situated, Scotland is a really good place to be. I mean, there's a lot of fairly good policy ideas, projects, the sort of things that many of my colleagues in the global space would be really envious to have on the statute books. I think and then you come back to Scotland and what you see is that they're too timidly implemented. So we've got what I would describe as maybe the nascent beginnings of the sort of changes we need to build a well-being economy, but they haven't had nearly enough life breathed into them. And I published a piece a few weeks ago with my friend Peter Kelly at the Poverty Alliance, basically saying what the Scottish Government and other agencies need to do is double down on what they've already got rather than dial back. And I think that's a situation where we are in Scotland. We've got lots of tentative steps, you know, things like Zero Waste Scotland. The business pledge is a great example. We've got support for those pro-social business models like cooperatives that Shonaig and I sort of have a mutual adoration of. Entirely so excited by the potential of cooperatives. We've got ambitious climate legislation. We've got good gender equality, but it's not it's not enough yet. They're still timid. They're not yet the sort of the mainstream of policy making yet. And so what we need to do is sort of ramp them up and bolster them so that they can, because they are the seeds, if you like, you know, with more of they are the sort of policies that we need to create a wellbeing economy. We just need them to be applied with a bit more vigor. And the business pledge, I think, is a really good example of that, because it starts to put a bit of conditionality on government support, but I don't think it has nearly enough teeth. And I mean, wouldn't it be brilliant if we took the idea of the business pledge and we said, no business in Scotland is going to get government support without signing up to the business pledge? I mean, we shouldn't, and it's really good. I mean, it's sad, I think, that it took the Greens to put the condition of not being involved in tax havens on government support in Scotland, following the likes of Denmark. But I think that's pathetic that it took the Greens. It should have been a sort of a thought from the very beginning. Also having climate plans in place for the sort of businesses that are receiving our money through government bailouts and government investment. So I think, you know, conditionality along the lines of the business pledge needs to be the name of the game. But there is a lot of good stuff happening in Scotland that's just way too tentative.
Great, thank you. Got a lot of good questions, so I'll try and crack through a few more. Can I come to Josh Arundel next? You had a question, I think, about other countries' experience. Do you want to come in, or Laura?
Oh yeah, yeah. Something that we discussed was, what are some examples of countries who have managed without growth, and what can we learn from them?
I guess that's one to me. So no country has done this perfectly yet. So this is why we really need to not look to old recipes, because it hasn't really been achieved yet. What there are, though, is illustrations of possibility. And so in the book that Kathy mentioned, that I had out earlier last year, we talk about two countries that sort of a sense of the possibility. So one is Japan, that has had decades of no GDP growth, but fairly high levels of life expectancy, relatively low levels of poverty. Where they fall down on social progress measures are things like work-life balance, gender equality, and that they, I think, come from a mentality that's still a growth-orientated mentality. Like they're still trying to squeeze every last drop out of growth, and they're pushing and, you know, pedaling faster. And yet they're an economy that actually, it hasn't been a catastrophe for them to not have GDP growth over the last few decades. The other country that we can turn to for some inspiration is another beautiful mountainous country of about 5 million people, and that's Costa Rica. Now, Costa Rica is a sort of middle income country in terms of GDP, but has got a higher life expectancy than the US. Relatively low levels of inequality, amazing biodiversity, very high levels of education, preventative healthcare system, and they're not perfect by any means, because no country is yet. But I think those two countries together give us a sense of the possibility. So, and there's lots of lovely stuff written about Costa Rica. The other countries that we can look to in terms of countries that are embracing this agenda are countries, rather nicely, that Scotland is already teaming up with to learn from and to share from through a mechanism called the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, We Go. And I'm really proud that Scotland started that. It holds the secretariat, but they're joined with Iceland, New Zealand, and Wales, and hopefully a few more countries over the coming months and years. And that has been set up for governments to share and exchange and learn from each other, and hopefully go on a journey of continuous improvement. And there is quite a nice humility about those countries, because they recognise they haven't got there yet, but they want to go on that journey of improvement. Shonaig might have some other examples.
The one that I go back to is actually one of the poorest countries in the world, which is Nepal, who came up with the Global Happiness Index, and their government actually measures well-being and happiness. They thought it more appropriate for them, given their fragile environment. And I think it's very interesting that when the Scottish government, if you look at their national performance framework, it too has the beginnings of a different way of measuring the health of a nation, and not just on GDP. So I think every now and again we don't appreciate what's actually going on our own doorstep. And I think we have the beginnings of doing something very special, I think.
Thank you. Helen McCrory, you had a question about privatisation of internet. Do you want to raise that one and maybe go to Shonaig first? Are you unmuted, Helen? Is Helen still with us?
Hi there. Hi there. We were talking a lot about huge companies like Google and Amazon, how they have massive monopolies, but also the actual infrastructure of the internet and the fact that this is all privatized. Is this a barrier to the well-being economy, really? And we were also talking about like the open source movement. However, it doesn't seem to have the momentum at the moment that it maybe once had. And yeah, we were just wondering, is this a barrier to the well-being economy, and what do we do about this, really?
I think it is. I think the thing that worries me more, rather than the infrastructure of the internet, is what's happening with our own personal data and how it is being used. Now, Katherine will remember the name of the academic. I cannot remember her name, but effectively our own data is being sold back to us to determine what we do against us. And I do think that, you know, despite there is regulation around the world on data, I think it was designed for what I'm going to call an analog world, that rather than the world that we have now. And I think there is a need for a global consensus on how everyone's data should be used and shared. Everyone should have access to the internet. It's not there. I actually think it should be a human right, because I just think, how do you connect with the world now? That's the way to do it. But I think we're a long way from that, and that's partly because of the power of some of these very large corporates which are headquartered in the States, and they don't seem to be prepared to tackle them in any way. It'll be interesting to see how companies like Alibaba in China, where of course there's a completely different regime there, how they are sort of drawn in or out by the Chinese government if it's thought to be a threat to their economy.
Katherine, if you don't mind, I think we'll move on to another question. We're running quite short of time
now. I just really quickly, Kathy, there's something about, I mean, the internet company, I'm going to show you folks, I can't see that for the reflection. So this was a spread in yesterday's FT, and it was of the 100 companies whose market capitalization had risen the most since the beginning of the year. So basically the companies that had done really, really well out of the pandemic. And guess which companies they are? It's Zoom, it's Apple, it's Amazon, it's technology companies. These are the ones whose coffers, their corporate coffers, will be full of money right now. And partly that's on the back of the pandemic, but it's also partly on the back because there are systems they're businesses that are set up where they extract rents from basically publicly created technology and research and development. So they're the sort of companies we need to be looking at for if we're thinking of a windfall tax, and we absolutely should be talking about a windfall tax in order to pay for a lot of the mechanisms we've had to put in place to support public health, even in the last few months. But your point around open source, I absolutely agree with Helen. I think it's really brilliant conversation we need to be talking about much more, not least in terms of when a vaccine for COVID is discovered. It has to be open source. Otherwise, we'll have the likes of GlaxoSmithKline yet getting richer while our friends and colleagues in Africa and Asia get sicker. So we need to have open source for those sorts of vaccines as well. Sorry to interrupt you, Kathy.
No, that's great. Thank you. That was important. I think hopefully we've got time to squeeze in 2 more questions. So can we go to Jenny Carpenter? I think you had a question about capturing the value of social care. Do you want to ask that one?
Hi. Anya and Di and I were talking about, is there an opportunity coming out of the pandemic to capture the value of community contribution and social care contributions in a wellbeing economy model, and how?
A start on
sorry,
that.
I didn't say who that should go to, but Shonaig, do you want to start with that?
I hope so. I mean, if you think about it, we have had lots of attempts in the UK to encourage more people to volunteer and to, you know, sort of have it as a sort of another arm of the economy. which has failed. I think what's happened, particularly with the NHS and social care, I, in my capacity as chairman of the Robertson Trust, we're talking to a lot of social care charities at the moment to help them skill up to build their capability and capacity to work with more volunteers, because I hope it doesn't go away. It's a really important part of community. It's actually an important part of our social values as a nation. So I do hope that more will come out of it, and that, you know, the National Health Service in Scotland, I do think increasingly recognise the benefits. But at the moment, if you are a charity providing services to the NHS in Scotland, you're not getting full cost recovery. So for me, that would be a big start to help them be sustainable and resilient, and then to build the capability and capacity to do more with wonderful, wonderful volunteers.
Okay, and Katherine?
Jenny, if it's okay, I'd slightly rephrase your question from capture to recognise, because I think what's one of the, I guess, outcomes of the crisis is people really recognising the importance of those sorts of professions, and just how literally life-saving they are. And yet there's such a, we don't financially reward them, but there's something bigger in that too, that if the social care sector, in terms of looking after people and helping keep people healthy, if they're successful, our mainstream measures of the economy might actually go down. So GDP could go down if people are kept healthy in their homes and in their communities, if they're not turning up to hospital for acute services. And I think the way we are so trained to measure our economic success through the lens of GDP doesn't at all celebrate the role of that prevention activity. So I think there's something there about not only how do we remunerate much more appropriately the individuals who are involved in the provision, but how do we recognise the success of their activities in a wider sense. I'm really hoping we can get one more question in, Kathy.
Yeah, I think we've got time for one more. I'm afraid there's been lots of good questions, but we'll capture them all, and you know, hopefully we'll be able to come back to them as well. The final question, if we can ask Ayler and Martin Valenti, you had a question in relation to example from Amsterdam.
The donut economy.
Fantastic conversation today. Well done to Katherine Shonaig and Kathy and Alan and everyone for organising it. It's been thrilling for a Sunday morning to sit and engage with you all. I always speak, and Katherine and I have worked before on various bits and pieces. We kind of sing from the same hymn sheet, although under different keys at times. But we have to be hopeful about the future. And I think there are countries and nations and cities. So I mentioned Amsterdam Donut. One of Katherine's peers and friends is Kate Rayworth and Mariana Mazzucato. Now, these are also very forward-thinking economists thinking about more than GDP. And our First Minister, believe it or not, is advised by Katherine and also by Mariana Mazzucato. So this is not completely new to government. We spoke about it in our breakout group. Government just need to be supported by us to do bolder things and stop holding them to account for things that don't really matter. You know, and start challenging them to step up and be a bit bolder. Amsterdam now have embraced fully the donut economic model, and again you can look at that. It's a fantastic book by Kate Rayworth, and it chats about system change and it chats about system values. It's far too much to go into in the next couple of minutes, but if you've got some time to read on a Sunday afternoon, you can have a look at that as well as Katherine's book, which is great. But have a look at donut economics, because it occurs to me that we've got the greatest opportunities to stand up, be counted, in 17 months from now, when the world's eyes are on Scotland and Glasgow for COP26. And if we aren't standing bold and brave and courageous about changing our system, about being more on the front foot, about selling hope, not peddling fear, I think we'll miss the opportunity of a lifetime. So if we can use the Comrie Conversation to kickstart community conversations and grow a community wealth fund, for example, and start to actually activate those people who really have the ambition and the desire and the capabilities to do great stuff, we could do amazing things. So the donut economic model, for me, we are pushing the wrong word, but we are cajoling the Scottish Government so that they will actually do something like the donut economic model for COP26. And that will be, you know, it'll spark it in Edinburgh, who don't like to see Glasgow do better things than them, if you get the drift. And what you do is you'll get this kind of competition happening with the 7 cities all trying to donut each other. So it's going to be interesting. But my last message is we need to start thinking about the opportunity rather than just be fearful about the Armageddon scenarios, because fear paralyzes, optimism mobilizes.
Great, thank you, Martin. Very inspiring words. But I wonder whether either of the speakers would like to come in on that. And I don't know whether there's any opportunity to give a one-line explanation of the donut model. But can I come to Shonaig first on that?
Nice to see Martin. We frequently speak about these things. The only thing I'm going to say is I think we're already moving on this. And one of the things you may not be aware of is that at the end of the summer, the Scottish National Investment Bank is going to be launched. This is the first time Scottish Government has its own investment bank, and it has got, it's mission driven, and its missions are achieving a just transition to net zero carbon by 2045, extending quality of opportunity through improving places by 2040, and harnessing innovation to enable our people to flourish by 2040. So there's good things going on in Scotland, and we need to encourage our politicians to be brave and do more.
Okay, Katherine, anything to add?
I wasn't fast enough to get the link, but if you put into a search engine, ideally Ecosia rather than Google, donut, Scottish donut, and my name, you'll find a paper, I think it was 2015, where we did basically what Amsterdam did. We did it for Scotland a couple of years ago, where we mapped where is Scotland in terms of sitting inside the donut. And to answer Helen's question, it's essentially saying we need an economy that doesn't breach those 9 planetary boundaries, but at the same time lifts people up above a social foundation. And we talk through the methodology and how complicated and messy that is, but it will give you it's a bit of a snapshot of where Scotland is in its environmental and social justice performance. So it's an Oxfam paper. I think it was about 2015, so you'll be able to find it hopefully readily. Tweet me if you can't, and I'll put it out on Twitter. The other point, just to pick up sort of a word Shonaig used, is encouraging politicians to be brave. There are some really good practices slowly, tentatively, timorously emerging in Scotland, but they are going against a headwind, and they're going against some of the very advice that governments are getting in their ears. And so it is up to, as Martin said, it is up to us communities to build that demand. I hear so often from policymakers that I work with, they can be bolder when they know they've got the country on their side, when they know that it's what Scottish people want. And so the more we talk about this, the louder we support it, the more we say this is the sort of things we want our politicians to be doing, the more they will step into this agenda. So absolutely more power to these sorts of spaces, because it's absolutely what is required to build the conversation and build the momentum. And then we'll have politicians hurrying to catch up. So this is absolutely what's needed, these sorts of meetings.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Well, we have run out of time, so I just want to say to both speakers, that's been hugely thought-provoking. Thank you everybody for your input. I think we've got some further reading to do. Some of the things that were mentioned there I think will be really useful to explore, and then we should really just keep the dialogue going. There's lots to explore in all of this, and there will be further opportunities for us all to discuss this, but talk to others about it. And let's see what we can do as a community to move forward on this agenda. So I'd like to, if we unmute everybody now, I'd like to give the 2 speakers a big round of applause, and thank you very much for your time this morning. So huge thanks for coming to talk to us. As I say, that's been really useful and interesting and thought-provoking. As we mentioned, the recordings and all the questions and the mind map will go onto the Facebook page. So if you keep an eye on the Facebook page, there will be, we'll post when that's up there. Do also give us any feedback on the event, anything you felt could be improved, anything about the structure, and any comments on other speakers that you'd like to hear in the future. You can either do that on the Facebook page or just reply to the email where you got the Zoom link sent to you. So lastly, the next event is in 2 weeks' time, Sunday the 5th of July, and the focus there will be on culture and how that will be affected coming out of the current situation. And we have Ruth Wishart and James Robertson for that one. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks again to the speakers. Stay safe and keep the dialogue going, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to Alan as well. Thanks to Alan for doing all the technology.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hi everyone.
Bye.
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 Arrivederci.
Suddenly seeing people popping up.
Last man left standing.
Hello.
Still here.
Right, be up in the top left corner.
We are knackered today.